Whereabouts?
And then once the application is set,
before we start, who in the room has heard of SalesforceDX? Okay, and keep your hand up if you've actually used it, maybe you've played with it, created a scratch org, getting less. And how many of you are using it in your day-to-day project delivery, development, or your ISV application? Okay, we actually have some experts in the room. Come on up and you can take over. So I'm an amateur using SalesforceDX. I'm looking at it, how we can use it, how our customers can use it, and how we can integrate with it. Wrong way. So what is SalesforceDX, for those that didn't know? It's a new set of tools that streamlines your development lifecycle, your application lifecycle. So really all it's doing is what other application languages you've been using for the past 30 years have been doing easily. It's sort of Salesforce are catching up and recognizing the fact it's very hard to do DevOps with Salesforce. Change sets, metadata API deployments are actually a little bit clunky. Destroy XMLs are really nasty to do it that way. And they're giving us a way to do it in a much more packaged way we can do things. It helps you improve your team collaboration by splitting up your application. So whether you're an end customer with your different applications in your end org, or you're an ISV or an SI partner, you're doing multiple phases, you can much easier modularize your application and have different packages going in that can or don't have to share a namespace as well. So when you upgrade those packages, again, any destruction, anything you remove from those packages, you can actually have automatically destroyed for you. So there's much less restrictions than there are with the traditional ISV packaging. It also suits itself for continuous integration and automation. So if, like myself, when you've worked in Salesforce, you've either had a project where you've used a dev sandbox and maybe everyone shared that dev sandbox, then maybe you thought, well, we need to be a bit better about this. We're going to have a VCS like Git. So then you've got a dev sandbox per developer, but how often do you really refresh those sandboxes? Okay, probably not that often. If you're great, you're doing it once per sprint. With SalesforceDX, you're looking at doing it on a change basis. So if you've got a user story to deliver or a bug to fix, spin up a scratch org, make the change, commit the change, scratch org dies, spin up a new one for the next change. So it's working at a much lower level. That means we don't have so many problems with merge requests. We don't have as many issues with our version management and source control. So ultimately, it's all about making you more agile. So some of the key features that I talked about, disposable scratch orgs. So it looks like a dev sandbox, feels like a dev sandbox, only it's smarter. So when you have a scratch org, you can create a scratch org of a particular edition with particular features enabled, such as multi-currency. So it's well worth looking at if you want to be able to test your application in different types of environment. Also, traditionally, as I say, applications are driven by a dev sandbox. It's org driven. That's really the master of what you're going to probably check into your Git. With SalesforceDX, it's much more source driven, so your Git becomes the master of everything you're doing, and the applications that you're deploying into your scratch orgs can also be deployed into your SIT sandbox or your UAT sandbox in production if you're using the unlocked packages. Now, it is command line based. I don't know who at Salesforce thought it was a great idea to say, hey, let's go back to command line. I hate command line myself. I've had to learn some of it. Just a quick word, there is a quiz on everything I'm saying and some prizes, okay? So pay attention for the next 30 minutes. But it is an open platform, so one of the things we want to do at Provar is we're going to write a plugin for SalesforceDX. So at some point in the future, safe harbor, forward-looking statement, you'll be able to do SFDX space Provar : run tests, okay? That's our plan, so it's incredibly powerful. And if you are looking, if you're an ISV or you're looking at the packaging 2.0, second generation packaging, then SalesforceDX is at the heart of that as well. So what is packaging 2.0? So we've had packaging 1 for a long time, the concept of unmanaged and managed packages. We're all used to doing that. And I've seen many customers actually using that on their projects in a way I never expected. So it's a more formal way of containerizing and versioning those applications and modules you've been building that gives you that parallel development. But it also gives you a very clear version number that's automatically iterated. So you can see in any sandbox or any scratch org you go to, what version of that module is installed. And actually you can roll back as well. You can go back to a previous version without having to go for a messy undeploy first. So it's much easier rollback. As I said already, when you have SalesforceDX, you have the concept of a dev hub. So if you've got a production org, you've probably got an option in your setup. Don't just go and switch it on without asking your admins. For enable dev hub, if you enable that dev hub, as you will see today, that becomes a way in which you can then author new Scratch orgs. But you can also associate to that Dev Hub your sandboxes and your live environments that you use in a traditional manner, so the same content can be deployed to both Scratch orgs and through your normal testing environments. There's the concept, two types of package. There's the concept of unlocked packages. Unlocked packages can be deployed to a live org, production org. So in fact, customers have got this first. If you're an ISV, you can't yet put your second generation developer control package in a live org. Okay, I imagine that's going to be one of the announcements in winter 19 and at Dreamforce. Just one other thing, both can have namespaces now. So unmanaged packages, no namespace. Managed packages, namespace. With second generation packaging, both can have namespaces. So again, it makes it easier to identify what component, an object, what package or what application does it belong to. Okay, so when we look at environments, when we're doing our code and unit tests, we're generally working with a Scratch org, multiple Scratch orgs, much faster, much more than you've probably used before. And we've got that tied to our version control repository. When it comes to continuous integration, what we're recommending is you do that also in a Scratch org as your first pass, your first test of those change functionality. So use the Scratch org for that as well. When you're ready, if you're building a package, when you're ready, you're sure you've got the right application, you pass your initial smoke test or unit tests, then you can package up, you can create your package version, and then you can deploy that into your, say, Developer Pro sandbox that you're using today as your, maybe your SIT environment, and your partial sandbox or your full sandbox as your UAT environments. And then when you're ready to, at least with the unlocked packages, you can put in your production org. So I hope that's clear. Keep going the wrong way. So when we look at the life cycle for SalesforceDX, there's nothing new here in the center, in the pink. The difference is, like every other programming language, the version control is the master now instead of the org. So 2 years ago, that box in the center was an org, let's be honest, no matter how much we used Git or anything else. So we still do planning, we still do coding, build, test, and release. There's nothing different about that cycle. Okay, but on the outside in grey, we've seen some different tools. So now we have the command line integration with third-party vendors, so editors, so things like Visual Studio. So huge shift in the last 12 months. So if you notice, Salesforce now demoing Visual Studio instead of Eclipse, or instead of Force.com IDE, or instead of Sublime. So yet another IDE to learn, but actually it's got some really cool plugins for SalesforceDX. You can still use Force.com IDE if you want, and lots of other vendors have built it into their deployment tools, such as Autoradic, Comparzo, GearSet, Flowsim, etc. You develop in your Scratch orgs, you build off the source, and then you go to your continuous integration. And we're going to mainly talk about that bottom right corner today, that continuous integration piece, and how you create a pipeline for it. On the left-hand side, we're still pushing deliveries out, we're still running our regression tests in the same way we've always done. We still have to use Sandbox for our performance testing, UAT, etc. So let's talk a bit more about that test automation piece. Let's see how we can create those tests and why we recommend a tool such as Provar, obviously.
Okay, thanks Richard. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about test automation. I guess the first thing I want to do is just to show a hand. So obviously unit testing within Salesforce, I think it's a great platform, but who's actually doing test automation at a higher level in the browser in the room at the moment? Okay, it's good to see, because we had none in Texas Streaming last week, by the way. So it's nice to see there are some people who are taking this seriously. But I think from a test automation standpoint, I think we can hopefully all accept that manual testing takes time. It is actually quite expensive as well, and it slows down your delivery. For me, it is actually fundamental to the agile development methodology. It is allowing us to be agile. And I think for the developers in the room, hopefully it catches your defects early. There's nothing worse than finding out defects halfway through the sprint when it could have been found day one. So to my mind, great, we need to understand and create our test cases, but from Richard's bringing in the DevOps pipeline, what's really important is that once we've created our tests, that we are running them regularly. So this is the thing where we have to have our automation running as part of our pipeline. It has to be part of, so this is where SalesforceDX come in. And then we're running our tests, and we can be running this on a nightly basis. And if you want that success, if you want that pipeline to get the results, this is a fundamental part of it. I mean, the advantages of doing it are mitigate risk. So to my mind, I don't know about you, but the amount of times I've found a defect come up the day before the release, and then you think, great, I fixed it. What happens then is the program manager probably has to make a call. Do we pull the release, or do we actually turn around and say, you know, we're going to go, but there's a risk because we cannot do 2 weeks of testing overnight. Whereas actually when we have this set up in this way, we can do an awful lot of testing. That brings confidence. That means that the developer can sleep well that night knowing his fix isn't going to blow up in production the next day. It also brings communication, because a lot of the time, once we get these processes, we can get the dashboards, we can get the MIS. This isn't just for developers and testers. This then goes to the program and the stakeholders, who can get a lot of faith that we're doing things correctly. The reduced overhead thing is, of course, that we don't have to do as many clicks ourselves. We can be sort of, you know, there's then more coverage. So if you're not spending all your days clicking around doing this manual testing, you're actually building out more test cases, which means more of the system gets tested. And then consistency is important, because again, if you're doing detailed testing, if you're doing financial calculations, a human will make an error, an automated program won't, and it will really make sure that we get the evidence around that as well. So why Provar? I mean, just a bit of background behind Provar. We're about 5.5 years old. We've got offices in London, New Delhi and Nashville in the States. We are Salesforce testing specialists, which basically means classic, lightning, communities. We're doing sort of all different things like console, that type of thing. So we've very much got the experience across the board. I think the key thing is that we do UI testing and API testing. So from that sense, I think we're trying to get best of both worlds. We don't want to have just a monolithic test that would be the way you did it manually. We can be smarter than that. The other thing that differentiates us is metadata. So there's a lot of information we can use to test Salesforce by asking Salesforce questions about layouts, the fields, the field types, and that's what Provar uses. And then finally, when we're doing Salesforce rollouts, you're very rarely just testing Salesforce. Of course, you're testing upstream applications, downstream applications, and what we need to be able to do is check that actually it all works together. And if we don't do it like that, then we get to UAT and it all goes back to manual, because that's the way the business is going to test it, is knowing that system, following it into this system. So our test automation, to save us that effort, is going to have to do that. So I'm going to start off now a demo. So it's going to start out with myself. I'm just going to create you a Provar test case, and we're going to see how we would author a test case in Provar. Then I'm going to sort of check that into source control, which is really the sort of handoff to Richard, because once it's now gone into Git, for example, we've got our test cases there. That kicks off our deployment pipeline, where we can sort of seeing all the subsequent tasks that come on afterwards, and then we'll see the pipeline and the reporting that goes with that at the end. So I am going to use sort of zooming in here, because otherwise you're going to really struggle to see what's going on, I'm sure. So this is Provar. It is a desktop product architected that way on purpose, because again, we want to be on a network, we want to be doing within your firewall, so we can do the upstream downstream testing. It's got lots of views, all very busy, but all very important, those views, as we go through. So what I've got here in the middle of our screen here is a test case. That test case has got a single step to launch Salesforce. Now I've already done that here, and you can see what we've got is Salesforce on the left hand side. When Provar logs in, it will automatically do the username password. It will automatically take us to the application of choice. And then what happens is we right click on the thing that we're interested in testing. You can see here, let me just zoom in, that we've got this add to test case. Now add to test case will essentially allow Provar to work out what it is we're looking at in Salesforce. Now ordinarily, if you've got any automated testers in the room, you'd be thinking about HTML of the page, you would be thinking about XPath, CSS. The big difference here is Provar is saying, well, I understand this layout is the property home. Now one thing to mention as well, by the way, this is a scratch org. So obviously this is fishtailing into our SalesforceDX talk. So it is something that you would spin up on the fly and then run these tests. Now what's interesting about it is from metadata, we know this field. We're not guessing, it just tells us this is the new button. We understand that. Now, and the interesting thing is, of course, is as things move around in your sprints, Provar dynamically refines it, so we don't suffer from that brittleness. Now, once we've located the field and we're happy, what happens is we get the chance to say, well, what do we want to do to this particular thing? Now, in this case, it's a button, so I want to click it. However, genuinely, it could be an alert, so I might want to click or confirm, click or cancel. It might be a PDF, I might want to download it, start pulling that into a variable and do regular expression testing. I might want to hover for tooltip testing, right click, double click, read assert, drag and drop. So all the different options are there, and I think this is in preference. If anyone's come across these record playback tools, you just click around, it spits out some code, and you end up slicing and dicing that to get it working. This approach means that we know what we're going to do, and then it's the test that actually runs. So when I choose add and do, what happens is it writes down that test step for us, and then what happens is it will run that straight away. So it's not the user clicking around at any points. It's always the test case, even at the authoring stage. So let's go in and sort of start adding some test steps. So again, it's a case of we right click into here, add to test case, and then over on the right hand side, it picks up the fact that this is now the property new screen, and I can go ahead and put in whatever I like over here. Make positive, for example. When we're doing a set command, you can see that we've got the option to tab off or press enter, so carriage return. So again, if you're doing the search in Salesforce, that might be, you'd want to immediately hit enter like the user would. And then again, what we do is we do add and do. So that will then sort of show us that, yes, I understand where that field is. I'll now populate that particular value into that field, and then we'll go forward and keep adding more fields. So it's very deliberate the way it does it. And in our case, let's say, for example, let's just put a few more fields in here, and we can go ahead and add whatever. So you're not particularly sort of double keying here. You can add it to Test Builder, or you can add it straight into the web browser, and then that will just add that for us. Now in our case, let's go ahead and add a large number of beds, because I think there is a validation rule on here. So what I need to do is go ahead and add 300 beds, which is a lot of beds, and you know, in ordinary stage, the validation rule's there to sort of make sure people aren't sort of fat keying onto the keyboard. So if we go ahead and hit save on here, what we'll see is, again, it's picking this up as a metadata field, and then we get our validation rule. Now what I'm going to do is then I want to test that's correctly fired. Now it's just an example. I mean, it's quite a common example. We want to test our validation rules. I then change the interaction type to read assert, and here I'm going to be pulling out the value, check the value. So this can be checking the fact that it's 300. Equally, what we might want to do is check the message. So I'm going to take the message from the screen in this case, and then put it straight in to our expected results. And from here, what we're able to do is we could equally say attributes. So a lot of the times we're testing different profiles. We want to know who these users are, and you might generally not care about anything other than the fact, is the field there? Because I've now logged in as a different user. Is it doing tab testing? Then I might just take a screenshot as well, because that's pretty good for our evidence. Then we'll go ahead and hit add and do. So then at this point we can see we've got our UI assert. It's running and it's gone green, which is a good sign. If I go back to Provar now, you'll see this view called Test Runner. And our Test Runner is showing us a few things. So we can see down here we've got our screenshot, which is great. That will end up in our test evidence. We can also see that we've got our 3 sort of checks. We've done our yes, it equals 300. Yes, we've got our number of beds. So that's really easy to work out what's going on. And then from here, what we can also do is do different things with regards to sort of renaming test steps. So it's quite useful a lot of the time. What we really want, again, Provar's a no-code testing tool, but it's even better that we can make it look exactly how we want to see it. So if you want, you can put BDD commands in, if you're familiar with behavioral-driven development, given when then. If you want in another language, for international clients, they might actually want to sort of write whatever they want for their users. So here we'll say something like assert beds in this case, and then OK. So again, I think that's really just a quick example of a UI test case. But I've said before about the fact we do UI and API, which I think is really powerful. So to my mind, what we might want to do is actually generate exactly the same property, but I don't want to launch a browser. I don't want to put 15 fields in. What I want to do is do that really quickly, because it's just seed data for further tests. So what you'll see down here is we have something called our org browser. Now org browser shows us all the objects in Salesforce. So we can see, for example, my property object, which is a custom object here. And then we can also see the data at the bottom. Now if I double click on the data, it's great. We can see the actual hidden fields, system fields, all that type of stuff, which is useful. But what I really want to use this for is I want to actually go ahead and sort of generate test data, and I want to just test. So if I go ahead and choose new test, what we'll do is we'll add our name for this test. Let me just zoom in again for everyone. Underscore Dreamhouse 2 in this case. And what we're going to do is we don't need to launch test build. The reason being is this is actually a API test. I don't particularly need my sort of right hand channel here, but what I do want to do is I want to generate a test step, and I can do that by dragging and dropping that into my test. And what we see is we get this menu. This menu is saying I can do SQL queries, I can do create, read, update and delete, and also I can extract layouts out and write that out to Excel, etc., for some smart testing there as well. But what we can see here is this is now giving us a test step without really having to work too hard. It's also brought in all the data from that existing step. Now, from my perspective, I look at this and think, okay, great, I've got some nice data. We've still got these sort of pick list values here, so they're preserved, and we can understand how we can easily maintain that. But also, I might think, well, I don't really want that name. So what I'm going to do is actually use one of Provar's APIs over here. So in this palette, because we're no code, you can see all the APIs that are going to do things like if statements, wait fors, looping with while statements. Also down the bottom here, we can see we've got things like the BDD statements, etc. Now what I'm going to use here is I'm just going to do a set values. Now a set values just allows me to create a variable. In this case, let's create ourselves a variable for the property name to make sure it's unique in the system, because obviously if we start running a lot of tests and overnight execution, you might want to identify that piece of test data. Now if I do control spacebar, this is where Provar brings up its functions. So again, if you're trying to do date logic, you don't want to be putting hard-coded dates in there. That's pretty rubbish for financial testing. We need to be using things like date add. In this case, what we'll go ahead and use unique ID. Now unique ID would allow us to say I want a unique ID of size 4. You could choose whether that's alpha, numeric and what have you, and you can append a string to it. Now from our perspective, we then want to use that variable. So if I go ahead, control spacebar, and then I just need to go and find that guy on the screen. So property name is there, and then essentially we have our test case. If I come out now and just want to run this, I can run this very quickly, and hopefully you can sort of see the value here where we're able to create this test quite quickly with drag and drop, but also when it executes, it's not having to launch a browser, it's not having to go through lots of different steps. Here it's just able to log into Salesforce, create my variable, and then create the property, and then it's the end of our test case. So that's really useful if you're doing lots of data generation and then you launch your browser. If you want to see an example of how a report might look, we can generate different types of reports. You can see here, this is a PDF file with the different timings and also the URL to what we're creating. Now, they're just little flavors of tests we can do. In addition to that, I could show you some email testing, database testing, but for now what I really want to do is sort of show you how we would fishtail into Richard. Now the way we would do that is we actually use Ant. So if I look here, we can generate our Ant task, and that's the thing that we'll use in order to sort of call from the command line and from Jenkins, for example. What you can see is your different options here. We're generating something called build.xml. We're selecting our test cases, so that here we can just choose our new test cases. That's good to go. And then we choose which environment. Is it UAT? Is it staging? We've got our web browser set up, and we can choose whether we're executing on which browser. Now on top of that, we can choose which sprint we're in, and also where do you want the email sent. You don't have to have this option, but do you want to get an email at the end of this execution alerting you to the fact it passed or failed? And then once we've done that, what happens is it generates us the build.xml, which you can now see on the left-hand side over here. Now, that's the step, that's great. We've got two test cases, we've got our ants. The next thing I need to do is make sure it gets into source control so we can continue our pipeline. So the approach to this is going to be that I will choose, this is my test that I want to sort of, these are the artifacts that I want to now start adding. So I can sort of choose these guys, and then right-click on here, which I have to probably zoom out for, and then we can choose to do team, and we can choose to do add to index down here. Now once that's added, we want to commit that into my Git repository, and we'll do that again with the team commit. And what we can see down in the bottom right hand corner now, if I zoom in, is we've now got the view of the world. We can see we've got some stage test cases that we want to start checking in. I then just need to put my commit message in and choose commit. And fine, we're sort of finished because we've created our test cases, we've made sure it's fully backed up. My team members can now see that, and then we can basically start syncing that down, and also more importantly hand over to our DevOps pipeline. So at this point I'm going to hand over to Richard.
Thank you, Geraint. So obviously if you've done user testing before, functional testing, you probably think that's a lot of effort to do one simple test. The point is you wouldn't just run that in Chrome, you'd run that in every browser you wanted to support or every desktop environment you want to support. So that same test can be executed in all those environments, and those UI tests can be running Classic and Lightning as well with just a few changes to parameters. So I'm going to talk about the SalesforceDX deployment pipeline. I've used Jenkins for this. There's a good article I've got a link to at the end that I think Dave Carroll wrote, or maybe it's Wade, and it gives you the whole walkthrough of setting up everything I'm about to show you. So if you're interested in Jenkins files and pipelines, it's all documented. It did still take me 2 days to set up with all that, but it's all there, it's all documented. And then I'm going to talk about the testing and the reporting side of it as well, and a package that's available on the App Exchange you can use. Before we get started, I did promise us a quiz. Take note of the following. So the steps I'm going to go through in my pipeline, the first thing I need to do, just make that present mode. The first thing I need to do is check out for my version control repository. So I'm using a Groovy script, okay? And that Groovy script, a nice simple stage, check out SCM. I'm then going to authenticate my Dev Hub credentials. So I've got a JWT bearer flow, so OAuth key for that I've stored. So I'm not using username and password for my Dev Hub, but my Jenkins instance can then go to the Dev Hub and make requests. I'm going to spin up a Scratch org as part of that pipeline. Hint, look at that carefully. And because we need to pass details to Provar, Provar doesn't know anything about this org. We've just built this in a different org. So as well as getting the username, we need to generate a password. We don't have to tell it what the password is. We can get it to generate a password. We save that, and we're going to pass that username password through to Provar as an override on its connection. Obviously, we've got our source code. We want to push that into the Scratch org that we've just created. There's nothing in there at the moment. Because there's nothing in there as well, what we need to make sure is that our profile for the Dreamhouse app at least needs the permission set assigned. So we assign the Dreamhouse permission. If I wanted to, I can create extra users as well with SalesforceDX. I'm then going to run my unit tests. There's no point doing any more unless my unit tests are working. My unit tests aren't running, my pipeline's over. Developers, what's up guys? The build's broken, it's your fault. It's got nothing to do with the test team, okay? If it has worked, then I want the test data that I'm going to use. Now we can actually do that in Provar using those APIs Geraint just showed you. So we can load data through that. We've got bulk API access as well. But actually in SalesforceDX there's a really nice import-export command which will save it in a JSON file for you with all the descriptors. So if you hate the SDL files for data loader, this is much easier, okay? But I think it only works on Scratch orgs, that's a shame. And the last step of the test is I want to run my Provar test, so that Ant script that Geraint just showed you. So let's have a look at this in practice. So I cleverly just closed my Jenkins instance. So let me just go back in there. I'm hoping it's that one. There we go. So I've built a Jenkins pipeline. So I've got a task here. You can see I've done some tests before. What that basically consists of is a Jenkins file. So I'll just have a look at that. So I know it's hard to see, guys, but basically what we have here is a number of different stages. So there's our checkout SCM, there's our authenticating Dev Hub, and it's just basically all the different SFDX commands. So I simplified them on the other slide. And for each stage, basically we get an output and we get a success or a failure, depending how we handle that standard out. We just create Scratch password, push that test org, run our Apex unit tests. Here you see I could do created users, loading that test data. Again, really, really easy once you've done it once, and not something you want to do from the command line every single time, in my opinion. So if you're using SalesforceDX, think about getting yourself a nice pipeline to use. Okay, so let's run this. Let's see it working in practice. So here's the live demo nervous bit when I hit build now and it all goes to pot. So, okay, so checking out source code shouldn't take too long. You've got history of what's going on. I can look at any of these things. I can see what's happened previously. I can see my Git commands running and any changes that it's pulled out. So I can see here, for example, that it's pulled out the 3 changes that we've committed. So that was our build.xml file and the 2 test cases. Haven't made any other changes in this case. It's going through creating those Scratch orgs. So it's doing that into a new Scratch org. As part of that, we're going to capture the username that's created with. There's a concept in Scratch orgs of aliasing. And what I didn't realize when I started with Scratch orgs is you can reuse an alias. I was using a new alias every time, but I use the same alias for my pipeline, then all my script is then off that one alias. So I don't have to repeat that username all the way through the script or parameterize it in any way. So it's a really easy way. So labels or aliases float across whichever the last Scratch org is you chose. I could have made the Scratch org the default one. That's also another way I could have done this. So we've got our scratch org created. We've got a password for it. See if there's anything meaningful in that. We then, in Provar, we run those using Selenium drivers in the browsers that you've selected when you build.xml. And there we go, we've got our results. So that's done, it's worked, thank God for that. Now, the output we've seen so far is nice little PDF report, HTML page. You can get to the JUnit report as well if you want to. Just go to the full stage here. So you can get to the JUnit output if you want to, but for me, it's been nicer if I had these test results in Salesforce so I could look at some trends over time. So what we did, we put an app on the App Exchange. It's free, it's in security review at the moment. So it's one of those things. It was a private listing because I didn't want to pay Salesforce any money, even though it's free, or go through any effort. But as of today or tomorrow, any private App Exchange apps will now carry a warning that have not been through security review. So I thought I'd better put our app through security review. So it will be reviewed soon. We're just in the final steps of that. So let me just go onto my Salesforce org here. So in my Salesforce org, I've got a couple of custom objects, one for a test suite. Every time I do a test run, I record what is the test, what's the name of it. Let's just refresh that. We should have one for World Tour. Here we go, London Salesforce demo. How many tests did I run in that? How many passed? What browser did I use? What was the screen resolution? Anything you want to do with that. That's fine, but let's pop that on a dashboard with our test cases. So for each test case as well, in Provar, I've actually got what we call a finally block. And in that finally block, I record a success or a failure. So what I'm able to do is put together a nice, whizzy, sexy lightning dashboard with all my test results in as well, in the same place that my users are using, so they know how the release is going. So I can see how I've done over time, pass versus fail. I've got my average pass rate, which might be what my bonus is tied to. Recent test history. Pass rate history, which you'd expect to be sawtooth. Developers do stuff. Guess what? They broke something. Test fail. You fix the test, or you fix that's wrong, and you go back up to 100% hopefully, or 90 odd percent, and you keep having that constant sawtooth. So that's the sort of behaviour we'd expect. The other thing I found useful was because we record the name of the test case and we're able to pass that as parameter from Provar, I can actually look at which of my test cases are the most brittle. So that's either because the test case itself isn't well written, okay, it's a bit flaky, or maybe the developers keep changing this same component and keep breaking my tests. So my test case may have been fine, but it's just a very dynamic component that we've tested. Also recent history and things like average number of tests you've run and the average duration. You get the idea. So hope that's been useful. I'm now going to test your knowledge about everything we've spoken about for the last 30 minutes. So I want you to go onto a website called Kahoot. So this is something Stephanie did at the World Tour, which I thought was extremely useful. And I've missed the slide out of here. Let's do it here. So if you go onto kahoot.it, on your phones, on your laptops, whatever you want to use. And I'll give you a game pin in a minute. And there are some prizes. There are some very useful flasks for carrying your cold drinks in this hot weather we're having, okay? Or in the winter, your hot drinks. It is actually a flask rather than just a water bottle. So let's play again. So what we're looking for is if you enter 386460, you'll join the game. Looks like I'm already on there somehow. Okay, I might lose this one. I'll give you a few minutes. 18 players so far, 20. It's not compulsory to enter. Provar employees are forbidden from winning. So don't worry about them. 35. Oh, they can play. They're just not allowed to win. 36. Any advance on 36? Okay. 37. Right. It's only 5 questions, so don't worry. It's not going to take long. Let's start. Okay. So you're going to get a symbol. It's going to be a question. So first question is, which SalesforceDX command is used to create a new Scratch org? SFDX force auth JWT grant, SFDX force create org, SFDX force org create, or SFDC org create. Pick your answer. It is time based. Your score will depend on how quickly you answer, because I'm sure you'd all get 5 out of 5 if I gave you enough time. Okay, well, most of the people know what they're doing and paid attention. A few need to have a think about the green answer, so FFDC or create, so maybe you missed the start of the presentation. Let's go on to the next question. Mahat's in the lead. Paul B in second place. Where are you, Paul? Can't see you today. Which of the following is not a good reason for Provar test automation? Is it reduces manual testing overhead? Is it avoids writing unit tests? Enables agile development? Or catch defects earlier in the life cycle, which is not a good reason? Two seconds left. One. Time up. Good, everyone's paying attention. Look at that. So yeah, we're not going to write unit tests for you. I get asked so many times, does it write unit tests? I think our second product will be something to write Apex unit tests, because so many people have asked for it. I don't think anyone's going to pay for it though, so it's going to have to be one of those community products. Paul's in the lead now. Okay, it's another Richie. That makes me feel better. SalesforceDX application lifecycle is, I don't know if I've got a voice to read all these, irrelevant. You can start anywhere in the cycle. Everyone's doing well. It's going to come down to fastest finger first, I'm sure. So yeah, I think a lot of us have been in this cycle before in the blue, where actually that's what we do in reality. We know we should be doing the yellow one, but the reality, we just keep changing it until it works and we get a clean bill of health. And until then, sometimes say, oh yeah, it's a design issue, so I've got to rewrite the whole thing. Maybe that's just me. Oh, new leader. I don't know why it's crossed out with a banning symbol, but we seem to be in the lead. Which of the following is true? Packages cannot remove custom fields they create. Only developer control packages can have namespaces. Unlocked packages can be deployed to production orgs. Developer control packages can be deployed to production. And the judge's decision, i.e. mine, is final, even if I'm wrong. Okay, so a lot more confusion on this one, so this is what I expected. If you've used managed packages, you think that's great. Of course, the ISV version's out there first. No, it isn't actually. So for ISVs, we're waiting a bit longer to have that same access. Final question. Richie's still in the lead. Anyone going to knock him off top spot? Which of the following is true about Provar? Tests cannot be checked into a VCS repo. Tests are just generated Selenium Java classes. It can only test Salesforce apps, or it binds test to metadata, not XPath locators by default. 5 seconds. Okay, people are listening, good stuff. So really important, we don't just test Salesforce. You've got a generic website page, anything else. We don't add the intelligence, we don't use metadata for those pages, but we can use XPath locators just as you would with any other test tool on generic website pages. And we don't write Java classes for you, okay? What we have is our own XML object, and that XML object at runtime we interpret, and that's why our tests will run both on classic, Lightning and mobile with the same test case without making any changes, okay? We don't write code for you. I think that's it. Let's find out who our winner is. First place, Richie, come on up and collect your flask. Who's Richie? Well, it's not me. It can't be me. I certainly didn't put a ghost symbol on. Or maybe it's my score from previously. Okay, Keir. It must have just my previous score. Maybe that's why it's got a ghost. I beat Keir for once. Matthias, Zed. Congratulations. Okay, we're going to have a change of speaker now, so if we all get a quick top up. I don't think there's any pizza left, but quick drink. Any toilet breaks, toilets just outside here. Ladies, just use the disabled one rather than go upstairs. It's probably easier and quicker.
One last point is there are a lot of t-shirts down there. Please help yourself if you want a Provar t-shirt.
Free swag. So back in 5 minutes. Which of the following is true? Packages cannot remove custom fields they create. Only developer control packages can have namespaces. Unlocked packages can be deployed to production orgs. Developer control packages can be deployed to production. And the judge's decision, i.e. mine, is final, even if I'm wrong. Okay, so a lot more confusion on this one. So this is what I expected. If you've used managed packages, you think that's great. Of course, the ISV version's out there first. No, it isn't actually. So for ISVs, we're waiting a bit longer to have that same access. Final question. Richie's still in the lead. Anyone going to knock him off top spot? Which of the following is true about Provar? Tests cannot be checked into a VCS repo. Tests are just generated Selenium Java classes. It can only test Salesforce apps, or it binds test the metadata, not XPath locators by default. 5 seconds. Okay, people are listening, good stuff. So really important, we don't just test Salesforce. You've got a generic website page, anything else. We don't add the intelligence, we don't use metadata for those pages, but we can use XPath locators just as you would with any other test tool on generic website pages. And we don't write Java classes for you, okay? What we have is our own XML object, and that XML object at runtime we interpret, and that's why our tests will run both on Classic, Lightning and mobile with the same test case without making any changes, okay? We don't write code for you. I think that's it. Let's find out who our winner is. First place, Richie, come on up and collect your flask. Who's Richie? Well, it's not me. It can't be me. I certainly didn't put a ghost symbol on. Or maybe it's my score from previously. Okay, Keir. I was gonna, it must have just my previous score. Maybe that's why it's got a ghost. I beat Keir for once. Matthias, Zed. Congratulations. Okay, we're going to have a change of speaker now, so if we all get a quick top up. I don't think there's any pizza left, but quick drink. Any toilet breaks, toilets just outside here. Ladies, just use the disabled one rather than go upstairs. It's probably easier and quicker.
One last point is there are lots of t-shirts down there. Please help yourself if you want a Provar t-shirt.
Free swag. So back in 5 minutes.